I'm Jay Tansky. I'm the Coastal Processing Specialist with New York Sea Grant, so I'm down on Long Island. And Laura asked me to come and talk about our experience with living shorelines. And when she said, could you give a brief overview, I thought of this painting. I don't know, some of you might have seen it, Bruegel's painting of the parable of the blind, where the blind lead the blind. If the blind are leading the blind, they fall into the ditch. Well, you might be able to see over here on the right, this is kind of New York's experience so far with living shorelines. But I think you might be able to learn from our mistakes, miscues, and errors, so Connecticut doesn't have to be one of these guys that seem to be heading in that direction. It looks like you're doing a better job than we did. But one thing I do want to point out, this guy might be on his back at the bottom of a ditch, but he is looking up. So we haven't given up hope. We actually started looking at living shorelines back in the 1990s. Again, don't want to discourage you, but that's when the Sea Grant first started looking at it. And at the time, we were interested in trying to use this technique in our South Shore estuaries, the bays with the barrier islands on the South Shore, and the Baconics, that area between the flukes. We really didn't look at it at that time as a viable resource or a viable approach in Long Island Sound because of, as Jennifer pointed out, because of the very high tidal range. That's a pretty energetic wave environment too. I'd say it's moderate to high depending on the conditions, and because of the shoreline types we have on Long Island, which is glacial bluffs. So we didn't really see that being as a place, at least not to introduce them. And we wanted to look at these areas because they had a lower tidal range, about 1 foot to 2 foot, or maybe even a little bit less. Wave energy was low to moderate. You can get some waves, as you will see. And if you go in and look at these shorelines, you can see some of the areas are a little bit developed. So we did have some stuff that we kind of wanted to protect. And we were experiencing slight erosion and some flooding problems also. So, of course, at that time, and still now, I have to say, the traditional and the preferred approach to dealing with these issues has been shore armoring. So we have a lot of different types of structures, the bulkheads, the revetments. Here's a gabion revetment. Here's an old seawall. They are still used, and they still do have their use, but as most people know, they also have some drawbacks. You can see they have some adverse environmental impacts. I think they're blamed for, in some cases, more things than they're actually responsible for, but they definitely have impacts that have to be considered. And the DEC was hesitant to permit these things, and people were opposed to them, and rightfully so in some of these areas, like you can see here. But the question was, what do you do if the DEC does not allow the structure to go in? In some cases, they were saying, well, just use vegetation. And that's an option that would, well, we know it doesn't work if you're just using vegetation and there's any type of wave action in that area. So we actually had our first workshop on this in 1996. Here's the brochure here. And at that time, living shorelines, that phrase hadn't even been coined, so we had to have this big, long, elaborate title to try to explain what we were doing. Innovative uses of breakwaters and coastal erosion control, integrating shoreline protection, estuarine habitat management. So at least we made some progress. We got it down to 2 words here. But we had experts come in, because people were working on that and having projects, and we had people come in. We took a look at what was being done in other places, what looked like it was working, what some of the problems were, what you had to consider. And we had a lot of interest. We had over 100 people at that meeting. And we started even looking at conceptual plans of what could be done in certain areas on the South Shore and the Baconics. We actually developed, like I said, conceptual plans looking at how to protect the marina, and it had, you might notice some of these pictures are the same, because these are the pictures of the projects that have been done back in the 1980s and 1990s. So we're starting to get a little bit better information about this. You can go to the next one. And we actually got local funding to not only do a conceptual design, but we did design a build design and had specs for a project that we were going to do on the South Shore of Long Island. This is Great South Bay, to take a dilapidated or a kind of derelict shoreline and turn it into this. For a variety of reasons, it didn't get funded completely. So we had the recession, a whole bunch of things happened. I don't know. We're hoping that this will go on and we'll have a demonstration project, because I think that's going to be very important if Connecticut wants to go ahead with this. But you have to know it is going to take a while. You can go to the next slide. We weren't real discouraged because we did see that people were starting to incorporate at least some of the concepts and ideas that we introduced at that workshop. You can see that there's a structure and vegetation put together. It wasn't just the structure here. And the state actually started embracing this. This is the upper quote is from a state sea level rise task force that came out before Sandy and Irene. And they said, yeah, that you should start looking at the soft engineering living shoreline techniques when you're looking at erosion control. So the state said, yeah, we're thinking about this. After Sandy, of course, there was greatly increased interest. And this is from the Governor's Commission on Infrastructure Needs in the wake of Sandy out to 2100. And they specifically said that you should be looking at including living shorelines. So they were starting, people are starting to come along thinking. But when we went and looked at the type of structures that were going in, actually in New York State, what we found is we weren't getting the typical, what we were considering living shorelines, which is you'd have offshore a small rock sill, which would allow vegetated wetlands, kind of a wide vegetated wetlands to grow here. Rather, what we were, and the important thing about my definition of a living shoreline, it's not, this is not a small breakwater. This is just a sill to allow the marsh to establish. It's the marsh that actually dissipates the wave energy if it's done correctly. Now, a breakwater is a coastal erosion structure, and that's just an engineering structure that's been around forever. But we weren't seeing this. We were seeing this, which you had kind of a low, what they call low sill bulkhead down here. This was usually built at mid-tide. You'll see if this one's up here, this is an important point. Usually this one above high water. But this was just built at about the mid-tide line. You had a narrow band of plant vegetation, and then you had another structure up behind it. And when we started to try to figure out why they were doing it this way, what we realized the problem was our tidal wetlands regulations. Now, I'm not going to go into detail because I don't have that much time, but what we found is that it's in the tidal wetlands regulations, the land use guidelines, you can construct a groin bulkhead in the intertidal or littoral zone. That's considered generally compatible. There's a permit required, but it's a minor project. However, if you want to put fill in an intertidal zone, it's presumptively incompatible and a permit's required. That makes it, when it says that, presumptively incompatible, permit required, most people are going to throw up their hands and walk away, rightfully so, because it's going to be very, very difficult to get that. So, go further. So here's what happens. We found out it's the permit and the permit conditions that were dictating design. And what would happen is, because of these tidal wetlands regulations, if you can hit that, if you look here, no work was allowed below mean low water. That was a problem right there. But not only that, they would require people to pull the toe of the structure as far landward as possible. Now what that did is, I showed you how much development we have on Long Island. What that did is made the amount of wetlands that you could have there much less. Rather than having the 20 to 30 feet that you would want to dissipate the wave energy, you're getting down to 10 to 14 feet. The other thing they required is this vertical face structure. The reason being they wanted to minimize the footprint of the whole project. So this vertical face structure has less of a footprint than a sill, a rubble mound sill, or a rubble mound breakwater, but it's also impermeable. So if you can hit that other one. So what that meant is that they had to lower the elevation of this to about mid-tide. They'll only allow you to go up to about mid-tide to allow water to get into the marsh, to nourish the marsh. Now that's fine. Problem is that also allows a lot of wave energy to get over and into here. And so the combination of you're not really blocking any of the waves, you don't have very little vegetation, you end up having to have this secondary protection. Now, here you go. These things actually, you can use them to build marshes. And you can see there's pretty lush vegetation here. It's not very wide, but it is pretty lush. The problem is that they don't withstand storms very well. If you go to this next one, here's one of these projects that pre-Sandy, and here it is after Sandy. So, well, well, actually it could have been the same thing. But you can see that what happens is a lot of water can come over. It actually caused scour. It knocked out most of the marsh. The marsh wasn't wide enough to dissipate the wave energy. And in this case, there's actually a revetment up here. You can't really see it that well, but there's actually damage to the revetment and a little bit beyond it. If you go to the next one, This structure, this structure did do what it was supposed to do in terms of protecting the upland. I don't know if you can say there's a lot of habitat value or environmental benefits for this area here. So, like I said, what we were finding is the regulations were resulting in bad projects. So we went back to the drawing board and said, okay, maybe people have changed, we'll try it again. And I think for this next one, this is the workshop that Laura mentioned. We had this back in 2013. Now we have 30 years of experience in different areas. So we brought some of the top experts in the country that have actually been building or designing, building these things and monitoring them. We had them come up and meet with our contractors, consultants, regulators, and the people that were doing the permitting. It too drew a good crowd. A lot of information was exchanged. And one of the things, I'm not going to go into everything that we try to do, but if you guys show the next one, we were able to identify where the limitations, or at least a lot of the factors that were limiting what we were trying to do. And the first one was the permitting issues. And it was the permits were actually encouraging people to put in bulkheads rather than living shorelines. So that's one of the first things I would take a look at if you're with the Connecticut Deep, to try to figure out where what those regulations are going to mean in the final permit design. The good news is that DEC, our Department of Environmental Conservation, is actually going back and looking at, they told me, I heard last week, that they have an internal group that's about to release new guidelines for permitting of living shorelines under the tidal wetlands regulations. Hopefully they'll be using those types of, the concepts and the information we got at the workshop. They'll be putting them in there. They're not going to, it's not going to go public, but they're going to start distributing it to some technical people to see what kind of consequences it might have. Some things you're not going to be able to change. I don't think these are ever going to be able to work a real living shoreline in a high energy situation. Also, I know Laura said they provide flood protection, but we found that they primarily are for erosion control and not flood protection unless they're designed a very specific way. So overall, I think you're going to have some issues with that. A big thing that we're looking at, though, is getting the information that people need to properly site, design, and construct these things. And again, I won't go into this. One of the problems we found is that there's no engineering design guidance. So there's no way a person can know exactly what type of protection these structures are going to provide. That becomes a very big issue if you're looking at doing these for erosion control. So if you go, one of the things we have been working on, we've been working with the American Society of Civil Engineers, and this goes back quite a way too. That American Society of Civil Engineers, they're the ones who develop all the engineering guidance for just about everything, whether it be skyscrapers, dams, that type of thing. So we've been working with the committee, and we've identified, I think it's 75 to 80 existing living shoreline projects. And we've been gathering information, 175 different parameters on these categories that you see here. And we've been trying to put it into a database and get this database online, which has been more than a problem because it's being done out of the American Society of Civil Engineers, but we have no budget for it at all. It's just people volunteering their time. But we are working on that, and that'll be used to begin developing this guidance. We hope to get it to a point where people can go in and look at these different projects, look at what the project performance was, and get some real information on them. It was actually introduced at the Restore Americans Estuaries meeting last November, but then they actually got a little bit of money to do some back-end work, and so the whole site is down now. That's why I'm not going to give you the URL right yet. But I think that might be it. Yeah, with that, I'll end. I'm not too far over.